So let's talk for a minute about Russia and what's going on in the Russian-Ukrainian war and give you my take on what's going on. So there are a few, really two prevailing schools of thought of what's going on. One is that Russia is doing offensive defense because Ukraine was becoming NATOized and they didn't want that kind of threat on their doorstep. So Russia did a preemptive strike on Ukraine to denazify and get rid of the NATO forces in Ukraine. And the other school of thought is that this war was always going to happen because Russia wants to push its borders into Eastern Europe in order to make their borders more defensible, and because they're preparing for their demographic collapse and they don't want to be invaded from the West like they have been with Napoleon and World War I and World War II. So I'll tell you what I think is going on. The sanctions have certainly hurt the Russian, especially the Russian state. Much of their revenue comes from oil and natural gas that they would normally export to Europe, but they're not. They're now exporting it at a discount because of the sanctions, and that has hurt the Russian economy. Not so much that it's collapsed, because we could see what the history of this is. There's different economic outlooks. If you read into that, they're all saying that Russia will actually grow economically at a very slow pace because they're not making the revenue that they would normally make. But nonetheless, these sanctions are not going to collapse the Russian economy, their war effort. It's not going to cause pain domestically to remove Putin from power. It hasn't, and it won't. Sanctions are usually ineffective. You look at the sanctions on Cuba, that wasn't effective. You look at the sanctions, well, they are effective on Iran, but it hasn't removed the regime, at least not as of yet. So with that said, if you look at the geopolitical situation, Russia is on Ukrainian territory. They have Crimea and they have the Donbass, and Ukraine by itself has no chance of taking those territories back. The Russians are inching forward very slowly. This is a type of warfare that's actually similar to like World War I, where the means of offense has evolved faster than the means of defense has. And so the motions are very slow, but Russia's in a position where it does not need a peace deal. Okay, Ukraine needs a peace deal a lot more than Russia does, because Ukraine is slowly losing the war, and Ukraine as a state is becoming increasingly dysfunctional. And I don't care what, you got all these different outlets, it's a lot of propaganda out there, but if you look into this situation, look at what's going on in Ukraine, they're scooping men off the street. Ukraine would collapse if it wasn't for Western support right now. So Russia's objective is not to take Ukraine, is not to take the entire geographic region of Ukraine. They might want the Russian areas. Their main goal, the big picture here, from what I think the Kremlin is looking at, is that they want to disassemble NATO. They want to put pressure on NATO by encroaching into Ukraine. They want NATO to throw everything they have at this, and they want to put pressure on NATO, and they eventually want to dissolve NATO. NATO is actually the big threat against Russia. Without NATO, these European countries are just individual countries with their own separate interests, and Russia can deal with that. Okay, they can deal with any one of these countries. This is not the 1930s and 40s anymore. Not any one of these countries have the capability of invading Russia. The Russians are looking at this, and they're thinking if they can collapse NATO, that would solve their security issues. And then they wouldn't have to, in that case, they wouldn't have to push their border all the way to Poland. So that's part of their strategic calculus, and that's why the Russians are going to play hardball. They're going to not accept any peace deal, that's unless it's completely onerous, knowing that Zelensky's not going to accept it, because if he does, he's out of power and probably dead shortly after that. So you have the situation where the Europeans and the Russians, neither side has an incentive to back down. because if they back down, that in itself could discredit NATO. So they want to do everything they can. They really want the United States. They want the Europeans. They want to suck the United States in to put more resources into NATO to make sure that NATO doesn't collapse. And Russia, on the other hand, wants to put pressure on this to collapse NATO. So that's probably, I think, a more accurate way to look at what's going on. And then after all this is said and done, the Russians, instead of taking Ukraine completely, they probably want to do what they did to Belarus and make it something like a puppet state. That's what they were doing before the war. So I believe this is what the Russian strategic position is. They're not going to outright take over Ukraine. They want to use Ukraine to collapse NATO and then replace it with a puppet state afterwards.